Danube trembles as a tide of desperate souls surges across its waters. Not invaders, but a people fleeing famine and fear. The mighty gates of Rome stand ajar, yet within, greed and betrayal twist welcome into oppression. Amid this chaos, a leader rises. Fritigern, a symbol of hope for the lost and hunted. Empires quake, soldiers prepare, and choices made in haste will decide the fate of millions. The storm of the Goths is coming, and the world as Rome knows it teeters on the brink of annihilation. Stay with us as we unravel the harrowing journey of the Goths and the fateful decisions that shook Rome to its core. Comment your thoughts, share the story, and witness history's dramatic turning point. The year was AD 376. Along the icy currents of the Danube, the riverbanks trembled as tens of thousands of Gothic men, women, and children pressed forward, their faces etched with desperation. They were not warriors seeking conquest. They were refugees fleeing hunger, death, and the relentless violence that had engulfed their lands. The forests of their homelands had been stripped bare, villages reduced to ash, and every path they trod seemed shadowed by doom. Across the waters of the mighty Danube, the walls of the Eastern Roman Empire loomed, symbols of civilization, order, and, they hoped, salvation. Yet salvation was never so simple. The Gothic multitude surged toward the empire, weary and starving, yet carrying a spirit unbroken. Their pleas echoed across the river, reaching ears both sympathetic and corrupt within the empire. Rome, confident in its grandeur and accustomed to commanding the world, debated their fate. Official decrees allowed the Goths to cross, but bureaucrats and local officials saw opportunity rather than mercy. What should have been a humanitarian act became a prelude to tragedy. The empire, so proud of its might and law, began to unravel not from the clash of swords but from greed and misjudgment. The crossing itself was a scene of haunting chaos. The river, swollen from spring rains, tossed fragile rafts and makeshift boats. Mothers clutched infants while the old and infirm stumbled in the cold water, their cries merging with the roar of the current. Soldiers stationed along the banks hesitated, uncertain whether to guide these desperate souls or enforce the strict discipline of Roman order. And in this liminal space, between survival and despair, the first seeds of disaster were sown. Once across, the Goths were met not with the relief they imagined, but with exploitation and humiliation. Landowners and Roman administrators, seeing only the potential for profit, levied taxes, seized supplies, and forced the newcomers into labor that broke bodies and spirits alike. Starvation did not end with the river crossing. It persisted, gnawing at the people who had survived famine and war, now trapped within walls meant to protect. Each day brought whispers of unrest, anger simmering beneath the surface, as the Gothic refugees realized that the empire's promises were as fragile as the wooden rafts that had carried them across the Danube. Rome, in its hubris, believed that an empire of stone and steel could tame the chaos of the human heart. But empires do not crumble from rivers alone. They fall when compassion falters and corruption reigns. As the Gothic refugees grew more desperate, murmurs of resistance began to echo across their encampments. Fathers taught sons the ways of battle they had once abandoned. Mothers whispered warnings of betrayal. Leaders rose from the ranks of the weary, not to conquer but to protect what little remained. Among them, Fritigern emerged, a figure whose presence would ignite both hope and fear, whose name would soon be spoken in the same breath as doom. Even as Rome prepared feasts for officials and passed decrees of welcome, the empire's foundations quivered. The Gothic Crossing was not a simple migration. It was a silent reckoning. The Danube had delivered not just refugees but a mirror, reflecting the empire's failings, its blind pride, and the dangerous complacency of rulers who assumed that 1,000 years of dominance guaranteed safety. The stage was set, the pieces moving inexorably toward a collision that would shake the empire to its core. And on that riverbank, in the chill mist of dawn, the first stirrings of a storm that would engulf Rome were already taking shape. Amid the mist and despair along the Danube, a figure emerged whose presence would alter the course of history. Fritigern, tall and weathered by years of warfare and exile, walked among his people not as a distant chieftain, but as one who bore their suffering on his own shoulders. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, scanned the horizon with the instincts of a leader who had survived countless perils. He knew that mere survival was not enough. Hope had to be kindled in hearts that had nearly forgotten its warmth. In him, the Gothic people saw not just a warrior, but a beacon, a promise that their desperate flight could lead to life, not death. Fritigern's rise was neither sudden nor accidental. He had led raids and battles in distant lands, yet his true strength lay in understanding the human spirit. He spoke to his people with a voice both commanding and gentle, reminding mothers that their children could live, that fathers could defend what remained of their families, and that elders could find dignity even in exile. He organized the weary into units, assigning scouts to forage and secure food, while teaching young men and women the art of defense. Every act of leadership, no matter how small, reaffirmed a vital truth. They were not lost, not yet. Under Fritigern's guidance, the Goths became more than refugees. They became a people with purpose. Discipline replaced despair. Strategy replaced panic. Those who had trembled at the sight of the Danube now built makeshift fortifications along their encampments. He inspired councils of elders and warriors alike, creating a unity that had been absent in the chaos of their flight. It was in these moments that the first whispers of legend began to surround his name. Fritigern, they said, he walks with the strength of our ancestors. He will not let us fall. But Fritigern was more than a symbol. He was a strategist, keenly aware of the delicate balance between trust and suspicion. Rome's welcome, as fragile and self-serving as it was, offered opportunities if approached with caution. He sent envoys to the imperial authorities bearing gifts and pledges of loyalty, presenting the Goths as allies rather than intruders. Yet beneath this diplomacy lay vigilance. He trained scouts to watch Roman movements, read the intentions in the eyes of the magistrates, and prepare for betrayal. In every gesture, every word, he taught his people that survival required both courage and cunning. The Gothic people responded to his leadership not with blind obedience, but with a fervent devotion born of necessity. They saw in him the embodiment of their shared struggle, the hunger, the loss, the relentless march through danger. Mothers whispered his name as they tucked children into makeshift beds, while fathers sharpened weapons and prepared for defense. Even those who had once doubted the wisdom of leaving their homeland now looked to him with unwavering trust. Fritigern had transformed fear into resolve, despair into determination, and refugees into a collective force that refused to be crushed. Yet his rise was shadowed by foreboding. He knew that Rome's magistrates were corrupt, that soldiers might underestimate his people, and that the empire's promise of sanctuary could quickly turn to chains. Each day he balanced the delicate act of nurturing hope while preparing for inevitable confrontation. His leadership was tested in skirmishes with rogue bands and in the harsh discipline required to prevent internal chaos. Through it all, he maintained the dignity and purpose of his people, showing that true heroism is not born solely in victory, but in the unwavering defense of life against impossible odds. Stories of his deeds began to circulate beyond the riverbanks. Traders and travelers whispered of a leader who could inspire loyalty without coercion, who could turn the tide of desperation into a force to be reckoned with. His name reached the ears of Roman officials, who underestimated the growing strength and unity he cultivated among his people. Yet even as Rome saw only numbers and refugees, Fritigern built a force tempered by hardship and bound by loyalty, a force that would one day challenge the might of an empire. In moments of quiet reflection, Fritigern would walk alone along the Danube, watching the river swirl with icy currents. He understood the gravity of his task. The survival of his people rested on his decisions, his courage, and his ability to see beyond immediate suffering to a horizon where hope endured. He thought of the children, the elders, the families who depended on him, and he steeled himself against fear. A leader's strength, he knew, must mirror the strength he demanded of his people. Only then could they endure what lay ahead. By the time the first murmurs of discontent among Roman officials became visible, the Gothic people were no longer a scattering of desperate refugees. They were a community bound by trust, discipline, and the unwavering guidance of Fritigern. He had turned the shadow of despair into a quiet flame of resilience. In every glance, every command, every act of courage, he prepared them for the trials to come, not for glory, but for life itself. And as the sun rose over the Danube, reflecting off the icy waters, it illuminated a force that Rome had underestimated, a people led by a hero whose heart and mind were as sharp as any blade. Thus, amid the chaos of migration and the fragile promises of empire, Fritigern stood resolute, not merely a warrior, not merely a leader, but the living embodiment of hope for a people on the brink of annihilation. His presence heralded the emergence of a force that would not only survive, but shape the destiny of empires. In the story of the Gothic Crossing, his name would become synonymous with courage, cunning, and the indomitable will to endure against all odds. Rome, the eternal city, had long prided itself on its unyielding order, its mastery of law, and the art of war. But as the Danube groaned under the weight of desperate Gothic souls, cracks in the empire's mighty facade began to widen. The Eastern Roman court, far from the frontiers yet intimately tied to the fate of those crossing its borders, became a theater of misjudgment, self-interest, and corruption. Officials who should have served as guardians of the law instead saw in the Goths an opportunity for profit. Taxes were levied on the starving, provisions seized, and promises of sanctuary twisted into chains of obligation. Rome, in its hubris, had welcomed the refugees, yet its welcome concealed betrayal. At the heart of this turmoil stood the imperial bureaucracy, whose vast machinery of governance moved sluggishly, yet decisively toward disaster. Governors and tax collectors, hungry for wealth and power, ignored the suffering around them. Supplies meant for the refugees were hoarded, sold, or siphoned off, leaving the people under Fritigern's care in a state of starvation and indignity. Roman soldiers charged with enforcing order along the frontier became enforcers of exploitation rather than protectors. The very walls intended to safeguard the empire became symbols of oppression to those who had sought refuge behind them. The rift within the empire was more than material. It was moral. Senators argued over protocol while children starved, magistrates debated rights while mothers cried out for aid, and the emperor's gaze, distant and abstract, failed to penetrate the suffering at the borders. In this environment of greed and negligence, the Gothic refugees' patience began to fray. Whispers of unrest grew louder with each day of humiliation, each act of abuse that reminded them that the empire's promises were hollow. Rome had built roads, aqueducts, and fortresses to display its power, yet these achievements could not conceal the rot within. This rot manifested most dangerously in the disparity between Rome's ideals and its actions. To the empire, the Goths were guests, wards of the state deserving protection. To the people enduring forced labor and confiscation of food, Rome was a tyrant in disguise. The laws meant to govern humane treatment were enforced selectively, bending in favor of those in power and against those without voice. It was a subtle yet insidious decay, an empire capable of crushing nations abroad, yet blind to the suffering within its own gates. The political climate worsened when rumors of Gothic dissatisfaction reached Constantinople. Courtiers debated whether to placate the newcomers or suppress them, and messages sent to the frontier oscillated between generosity and coercion. This indecision, a luxury of a distant court, was a death sentence to those living on the edge. Each decree, each delayed order, compounded the sense of betrayal. Fritigern, ever vigilant, observed these missteps, understanding that Rome's internal weakness could be turned to advantage, or, if mishandled, could ignite catastrophe. Amid this bureaucratic failure, divisions within the Roman military became apparent. Some commanders sought to defend the Gothic refugees, aware that the empire's honor and strategic position depended on it. Others saw only burden, opportunity for personal gain, or the inconvenience of hosting tens of thousands of unarmed, hungry people. Disunity among Rome's legions, once the pride of the empire, eroded the effectiveness of their frontier defense. Communication faltered, commands conflicted, and the chain of authority weakened. The empire's legendary discipline, which had won countless battles across Europe, Asia, and Africa, now stood in jeopardy from within. Even the emperor Valens faced a dilemma of perception versus reality. Reports arriving at court painted a picture of minor unrest among grateful refugees, yet the truth on the ground was far grimmer. Valens, relying on the words of officials whose judgment was clouded by greed and ambition, underestimated both the resolve of the Goths and the consequences of his inaction. His belief in Rome's invincibility, a product of centuries of triumph, blinded him to the slow-burning disaster festering along the Danube. What should have been a measured, compassionate governance became a gamble with lives on the line, a miscalculation whose stakes would soon become unbearably clear. The Gothic people, for their part, observed Rome's failings with sharp eyes. Fritigern understood that the empire's internal rot could be leveraged, not as a call to war, but as a test of patience and survival. Yet even with his guidance, tensions grew. Hunger, fear, and humiliation became tinder, waiting for the spark of rebellion. Mothers wept for their children. Fathers whispered warnings to sons. The elders recounted the empire's former glory and questioned whether its promise had vanished. Every slight, every act of exploitation deepened the growing chasm between those who had fled and the empire that had promised sanctuary. In this fragile and perilous environment, the seeds of catastrophe were already planted. The Danube Crossing had begun as a desperate plea for refuge, yet it was now a mirror reflecting Rome's deepest vulnerabilities: corruption, indecision, and moral decay. The walls of the empire, though mighty and imposing, could not shield against the consequences of neglect. The Gothic refugees, once helpless and desperate, were becoming a force shaped by suffering and guided by a leader who recognized both their potential and the empire's weaknesses. As spring gave way to summer, the pressure along the frontier intensified. Each day, more Goths arrived, swelling the population under Fritigern's guidance. Each day, more officials failed in their duty, enriching themselves while ignoring the cries of those they were meant to protect. And each day, the empire, proud and eternal, edged closer to a reckoning it was ill-prepared to face. The Danube, once a boundary marking civilization and barbarism, now flowed between the crumbling ideals of Rome and the rising determination of a people who would no longer be ignored. Rome, mighty and invincible in legend, had begun to tremble, not from the force of foreign swords, but from the decay within. The empire's grandeur could not mask its fragility, and the stage was set for the storm that would sweep across the Danube, altering the destiny of an empire and echoing through the annals of history for centuries to come. In its corridors of power, whispers of unease grew louder. Along the riverbanks, murmurs of revolt stirred. The collision was inevitable, and when it came, Rome would discover that no walls, no decrees, and no arrogance could save it from the consequences of its own failings. From the ashes of desperation rose a storm the empire could not yet comprehend. The Goths, once weary and hungry refugees, had transformed into a force both disciplined and relentless, bound by suffering and guided by the unyielding hand of Fritigern. Their march along the Danube was no longer the tremulous shuffle of fugitives. It was the measured advance of a people determined to survive, to claim life where oppression had sought to snuff it out. In the eyes of Rome, they remained a faceless multitude, but in truth they had become a tempest poised to strike. The transformation was as subtle as it was inexorable. Hunger sharpened their resolve. Humiliation honed their instincts. Mothers who had carried infants through icy waters now wielded makeshift weapons, defending their families with ferocious courage. Fathers who had once tilled fields now moved with the precision of warriors, their knowledge of terrain and survival repurposed for defense. Elders whose wisdom had long guided the clans became advisors, teaching patience, strategy, and the timing of strikes. Every human frailty, fear, fatigue, sorrow, was harnessed into a collective will that would not bow. Fritigern understood that desperation could be both a weapon and a liability. He disciplined his people not to seek conquest, but to preserve life, instilling the notion that every action must serve survival. He trained his young men in combat, teaching ambushes, formations, and the power of terrain. Scouts mapped the surrounding lands, noting Roman patrols and fortifications, rivers and forests, high ground and marshes. Every movement of the empire was observed, every misstep recorded. He turned fear into strategy, vulnerability into power. In the wilderness along the Danube, the Goths became more than refugees. They became an army forged in necessity. Yet the transformation was not merely physical. Spiritually, the Goths evolved. Their suffering had been immense, their trust betrayed by those who had promised sanctuary. Each slight, each act of exploitation by Roman officials fanned the flames of unity. Where Rome had sought to oppress, Fritigern cultivated resilience. Where officials had sown despair, he planted hope. He reminded his people that their ancestors had survived floods, famines, and invasions, and that they too could endure. From whispered tales around campfires to solemn councils in the dark, he infused courage into hearts that had once trembled. As the empire gawked from distant halls of power, they misread the growing force along the riverbanks. To Valens and his commanders, the Goths were scattered refugees, too weak and disorganized to threaten the might of Rome. Yet each night, as the river's currents glistened in moonlight, Fritigern's people drilled, trained, and sharpened not only weapons but purpose. Bowstrings hummed, spears gleamed, and shields were tested against strikes that mimicked the chaos of battle. Rome's complacency, born of centuries of unbroken victories, blinded it to the latent storm gathering just beyond its borders. The psychological transformation was perhaps the most potent weapon. Desperation had bred a fearless determination. Survival had forged a ruthless clarity. Soldiers once cowed by hunger and fatigue now faced their enemies with the calm ferocity of those who had nothing left to lose but life itself. They learned to strike swiftly, retreat strategically, and exploit every weakness in the empire's overstretched frontier. Every encounter, no matter how small, honed their instincts, transforming scattered groups into coordinated units that moved as one. They were no longer refugees, they were the embodiment of inevitability. Stories of minor skirmishes began to filter back to Roman commanders. A supply convoy intercepted here, a small patrol routed there. Each incident a whisper of what was to come. Yet Rome's officials dismissed these signs, attributing them to luck or coincidence. They could not fathom that the people they had oppressed and humiliated were becoming a force formidable enough to challenge centuries of imperial dominance. The Gothic storm was rising, but the empire still believed it controlled the narrative, still believed that the Danube could contain the tide. And yet, the river itself seemed to conspire with Fritigern. The forests and wetlands along its banks became natural defenses, channels for ambush and paths for rapid movement. Scouts familiar with the terrain guided the Gothic forces along hidden trails, ensuring that every advance and retreat served both safety and strategic advantage. Rome's reliance on conventional tactics and overconfidence in discipline made it ill-prepared for an enemy that had learned to adapt, improvise, and endure in ways the empire could not anticipate. Fritigern's genius lay in his understanding of human nature. He knew that a people pressed too hard, denied sustenance and dignity, would respond not with meekness, but with a storm of vengeance tempered by reason. Unlike previous leaders who might have sought glory or conquest, he led for survival and preservation. His foresight ensured that every act of preparation, every council and drill, transformed desperation into coordinated power. And as the months passed, the Gothic army swelled, not only in numbers but in skill, resolve, and unity. By the time news of their growing strength reached Valens, it was already too late to underestimate the scale of the threat. What had begun as a river crossing of refugees had evolved into an existential challenge to Rome itself. The Goths, guided by Fritigern, were no longer fleeing. They were poised, disciplined, and ready to defend themselves against any who would deny them life. The empire, for all its wealth, fortifications, and centuries of victories, now faced a people who had learned the harshest lesson of all, that survival against betrayal breeds a force unmatched in determination. In the twilight before confrontation, as the sun dipped behind the forest lining the Danube, the Gothic people stood ready. Mothers held children close, warriors sharpened blades, and elders offered counsel in solemn tones. Fritigern moved among them, calm yet resolute, embodying the storm he had helped create. Rome, confident yet blind, had dismissed the refugees as weak. It did not know that the very suffering it had caused had forged the mightiest enemy it had ever faced. In the coming clash, the empire would discover that desperation, when guided by wisdom and will, could become an unstoppable tempest. And from this tempest, history would remember the day the Danube became a battlefield, the day Rome confronted a force born not of ambition, but of survival itself. Far from the mist-laden banks of the Danube, in the marble halls of Constantinople, Emperor Valens sat in a throne room that seemed impervious to the chaos stirring at the empire's fringes. Maps stretched across polished tables, marked with rivers, fortresses, and the settlements of both allies and foes. Courtiers and generals stood at attention, their voices a chorus of advice, warnings, and self-interest. Yet Valens, seasoned by years of command, understood that the decisions he made in these sunlit chambers could determine not just victory or defeat, but the very survival of Rome's eastern territories. Reports had reached him of the Gothic Crossing, tens of thousands of people surging across the Danube, driven by famine, fear, and desperation. Initially, Valens had regarded these reports as routine, refugees seeking asylum, a problem to be managed by frontier commanders. But as intelligence arrived of unrest, of minor skirmishes, and of growing unity under Fritigern, the emperor recognized that inaction could no longer be an option. The survival of the empire demanded intervention, decisive and immediate. Valens rose from his throne, moving with the measured authority of a man accustomed to command yet aware of the precariousness of his position. He convened a council of his most trusted generals, mapping out strategies that ranged from diplomacy to decisive military action. Yet the council was divided. Some argued that negotiation, gifts, and concessions could secure peace. Others insisted on preemptive strikes to scatter the Gothic population before it became a threat. Voices clashed, the echoes of debate filling the marbled chamber, while Valens weighed each argument with the care of a man whose choices bore the weight of millions of lives. In these deliberations, Valens saw both the strengths and vulnerabilities of his empire. Rome's legions remained formidable, their discipline and training unmatched across the known world. Yet the emperor knew the lessons of history. Even the strongest army can falter when faced with an opponent who understands the terrain, the psychology, and the limits of human endurance. The Gothic people, though counted in tens of thousands, had already demonstrated resilience, unity, and cunning. To confront them recklessly would be to gamble the prestige, power, and very life of the empire on a single stroke of luck. Despite these cautions, Valens recognized the need to project confidence. A delay could embolden the Goths, allowing Fritigern to consolidate strength, organize defenses, and turn desperation into a tactical advantage. With urgency tempered by careful thought, the emperor issued orders for mobilization. Legions from surrounding provinces were summoned, cavalry readied, and supplies stockpiled. Every move was calculated to assert the might of Rome, to remind both refugee and soldier that the empire still commanded the frontier. Yet even as the wheels of military logistics turned, Valens understood that leadership demanded more than strategy. It demanded presence, decisiveness, and moral authority. He addressed his officers directly, emphasizing the glory and responsibility of defending Rome's eastern borders. His speeches, measured yet impassioned, sought to unify disparate commanders under a single vision: the preservation of the empire, the protection of its citizens, and the restoration of order along the Danube. In his words, one sensed both the weight of history and the urgency of the present crisis. Aware of the moral dimensions of the conflict, Valens also wrestled privately with the humanity of the Gothic plight. He recognized that the people he faced were driven by desperation, not ambition. Yet he reasoned that an unchecked mass of refugees, organized and armed by circumstance, could threaten not only frontier settlements, but the stability of the empire itself. Thus he sought a delicate balance, to act with sufficient force to maintain control, yet avoid unnecessary cruelty that might inflame rebellion further. The emperor's mind became a battlefield of calculation, ethics, and foresight. In preparation for confrontation, Valens personally reviewed the training and readiness of his troops. He inspected legionaries' armor, weapons, and formations, ensuring that no detail was overlooked. Drills were intensified, commanders briefed on potential Gothic tactics, and contingency plans devised for ambushes or sudden uprisings. The emperor's presence, a mixture of stern authority and visible concern, instilled both discipline and urgency in the ranks. Every soldier understood that the coming encounter might define not only their careers, but the very survival of the empire they served. Yet the emperor's actions were shadowed by the limitations of his knowledge. Reports from the frontier often lagged behind reality, filtered through officials whose motivations were as mixed as the empire's fortunes. The scale of Gothic organization, the depth of loyalty to Fritigern, and the adaptability of the refugees were aspects Valens could only estimate. His strategies, grounded in centuries of military tradition, faced an opponent shaped by desperation, cunning, and unity born of suffering. The gulf between expectation and reality loomed ominously, a silent threat that no amount of planning could fully anticipate. As the Danube swelled with the passage of Fritigern's people, Valens dispatched envoys to negotiate, to gauge intentions, and to prepare the way for possible peace or conflict. The emperor's hope was that reason might avert disaster, that diplomacy could prevent bloodshed. Yet he also understood the stark reality. If compromise failed, if the Goths chose to resist, or if opportunity outweighed prudence, the empire would be forced to meet the storm with steel and discipline. Rome's fate now rested on a knife edge. The next moves in this perilous game determined by judgment, courage, and the unpredictable will of those across the river. In the quiet hours before battle, Valens surveyed the preparations of his army, feeling the gravity of the responsibility he bore. Soldiers trained, commanders strategized, and the empire braced itself against an unknown force whose strength had already been underestimated. He was the pivot upon which the fate of the eastern provinces balanced, the hand that would either steady Rome or inadvertently deliver it into chaos. Every decision, every command, every measure of foresight mattered. The emperor's resolve, tempered by awareness of both his own power and its limits, was the final preparation for the approaching confrontation. Thus, on the eve of collision, Valens embodied both the hope and the vulnerability of Rome itself. He represented the empire's strength, experience, and capacity for decisive action, but also its hubris, its reliance on tradition, and its occasional blindness to the adaptability of human spirit. Across the Danube, Fritigern marshaled his people with similar intensity, each aware that the coming encounter would define the destinies of countless lives. The stage was set, the players in position, and the inexorable march toward Adrianople had begun. What followed would test the might of Rome, the wisdom of its emperor, and the endurance of a people transformed by desperation into a storm of living fury. The dawn of battle broke over the fields near Adrianople, painting the horizon in hues of gold and crimson. Mist curled above the Danube's swollen waters, hiding the movements of thousands, yet it could not conceal the tension that gripped both Roman and Gothic forces. Valens, clad in imperial armor that gleamed in the rising sun, surveyed his legions with a mixture of pride and determination. Discipline and tradition had served Rome for centuries, yet the enemy before him was unlike any other, desperate, unified, and guided by a leader whose cunning matched their survival instincts. Fritigern across the field observed the Roman formations with a keen eye. He knew the men before him were trained, armored, and experienced in warfare. Yet he also understood that desperation could be a sharper weapon than steel. His people had endured famine, abuse, and betrayal. They fought now not for conquest, but for life itself. Every mother, father, and child within his command lent strength to the army, their collective will as formidable as any legion. In the quiet before the clash, he whispered to his captains, "Remember what we fight for. Today the river bears witness to our resolve." The initial engagement was thunderous. Roman legions advanced with rigid precision, shields aligned, spears ready, and standards held high. The Goths met them with fierce determination, using terrain to their advantage, ambushing flanks, and exploiting the confusion sown by marshy ground and forested cover. The disciplined advance of Rome faltered under the relentless pressure of an enemy unburdened by fear. The legions, trained to dominate in open fields, struggled against an adversary whose movements were unpredictable and whose morale was fueled by survival, not glory. As the battle intensified, it became evident that the empire had misjudged the strength and cohesion of its enemy. Fritigern's forces struck with coordinated precision, encircling Roman units and severing lines of communication. Archers rained fire from concealed positions, cavalry harried flanks, and infantry pressed relentlessly. The very desperation that had once made the Goths vulnerable now became the crucible of their power. Valens, observing from the center of his command, realized too late that strategy and experience alone could not overcome the unity and resolve of an opponent forged by suffering. Chaos engulfed the Roman ranks. Soldiers who had faced countless enemies across the empire now found themselves cut off, isolated, and overwhelmed. The discipline that had once ensured victory faltered under the storm of unrelenting assault. Shouts of command were drowned by the clash of weapons, cries of the wounded, and the roar of desperate fighters. Valens himself was drawn into the heart of the maelstrom, seeking to rally his men, yet even his presence could not stem the tide. The emperor's armor, polished and imposing, became a symbol of the empire's vulnerability, visible yet insufficient against the relentless force of a people who would not yield. In the midst of battle, the Gothic forces pressed every advantage. They exploited Roman misjudgments, striking where walls of discipline faltered and turning hesitation into catastrophe. Soldiers trained for conventional combat were unprepared for the adaptability and cunning of Fritigern's command. Each maneuver, each coordinated strike, further eroded Rome's confidence. The river that had once symbolized boundary and protection now framed the theater of defeat, bearing silent witness to the unraveling of an empire's authority. The climax of the encounter arrived with harrowing intensity. Valens, fully aware of the stakes, attempted to rally a counteroffensive. Yet the Gothic storm proved unstoppable. The emperor's forces were surrounded, formations broken, and legions decimated. In the chaos, Valens himself fell, swallowed by the fire of combat and the fury of a people denied justice. His death, a shock to both Romans and Goths, crystallized the outcome. The invincible empire had been humbled, not by superior arms, but by the culmination of desperation, unity, and the guidance of an inspired leader. In the aftermath, silence descended across the battlefield, punctuated only by the cries of survivors and the lamentations of the fallen. The Danube, once a river of passage, now reflected the wreckage of Rome's miscalculations and the resolute power of the Goths. Fritigern's people, though victorious, mourned their dead even as they stood triumphant. Survival had been secured, yet the cost was immense, and the echoes of Adrianople would reverberate through the corridors of history. Rome, stunned by the scale of the defeat, faced the sobering truth. Centuries of invincibility could not shield it from the consequences of internal decay, misjudgment, and underestimation of human will. The empire's walls and legions had been formidable, yet they had crumbled under the pressure of a desperate, united people led with foresight and courage. Across the empire, officials and citizens alike realized that the Danube no longer marked an impenetrable boundary, but the beginning of a new, uncertain era. The Gothic victory at Adrianople reshaped the power dynamics of the region. Tribes once scattered and oppressed found a model of leadership and resilience in Fritigern. His people had survived not by mere chance, but through discipline, strategic acumen, and an unbreakable unity forged in suffering. The empire, though battered, would endure, but the lesson was indelible. The might of Rome was not limitless, and the resolve of the desperate could rival any army in the known world. History would remember the day not simply for the death of an emperor, nor for the loss of legions, but for the irreversible shift it signaled. The Gothic crossing of the Danube and the subsequent clash at Adrianople revealed the fragile underpinnings of an empire resting on pride, wealth, and centuries of precedent. In that crucible of battle, the resilience of a people denied sanctuary and the foresight of a determined leader turned desperation into triumph. Rome's heart had been shaken, its certainty challenged, and its path forever altered. And so, as the sun set over the blood-soaked fields near Adrianople, the survivors, both Gothic and Roman, stood witness to a transformation that transcended the immediate carnage. The empire had learned that walls alone cannot contain the force of human determination, and the Goths had learned that unity, guided by courage and wisdom, could withstand even the mightiest of empires. In the annals of history, the battle would endure not only as a tragedy for Rome, but as a testament to the enduring power of hope, leadership, and the indomitable will to survive.